Okay. My name is Madrone. It is my great pleasure to present to you the last panel of our conference, focusing on Italian national security. Unfortunately, our chair, which was supposed to be Dr. Jeffrey Edwards, has had important family problems, commitment, so he can't be here today. So I'll just be helping with taking the questions and maintaining the time. I won't really be speaking about the topic at all, obviously. And our experts here will be able to provide some very interesting talks on that. So, so I'll just quickly present our distinguished panelists, and then we'll just start straight because we're kind of late on time, unfortunately. So starting from the far left, Dr. Raffaello Matarazzo. He is adjunct professor of strategic studies at the University of Perugia and associate fellow of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. He has published widely on European integration, European foreign policy, and security studies and transatlantic relations. He's had experience in the European Parliament in Brussels. He's acted as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Commission in the Chamber of Deputies, and has a PhD in European history from the University of La Sapienza in Rome. Then next on the panel is Alessandro Madrone. He's a senior fellow of Istituto Affari Internazionali Security and Defense Program. He's been responsible for research projects funded by the European Commission, the European Defense Agency, and Nato, and has co-authored the annual report, annual report on defense budgets and industry, and is actually an alumni of the LSE. So welcome back to the LSE. And he's member of the editorial board of the IAI webzine Affari Internazionali and collaborates as a freelance journalist with several Italian magazines, including Aspegna and Air Press. And lastly, Dr. Nicola Chilotti. He is an LSE fellow in international relations and has previously held posts at UCL. He's taught courses on the politics of European Union and European policymaking. His research primarily investigates the role of bureaucracies in foreign policy making. And actually, on this topic, he's finalizing a book to be published later this year by Routledge. So we should check that out. So without further ado, I think we can just start in the order that I guess I presented everyone. Yeah, and so
okay.
Let's start.
So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm talking in personal capacity, so my opinions do not involve the institutions I work with. And let me just say that I completely share the approach of Professor Tello's presentation. And in the light of the experience at the Institute of International Affairs or the more recent experience in a big Italian international company, energy company, the interest that international actors or Asian delegations, Latin American experts have about Italy's foreign policy or Italy's international role in the light of my experience is always linked to the role that Italy can play within the wider context of the European Union. So never, at least I think that today, more than 20 years ago, their interest in Italy is more the interest in Italy's role in changing the European Union positions about the economy, about security, about foreign policy, rather than an interest for what Italy per se can do, for example, in Libya, in the Balkans, about immigration. Also because the overall approach that Italy has on this general issue is more and more linked, as Professor Tello underlined, conceptually and practically to what the European Union can do. So, said that as a general introduction, my presentation was asked to be focused on the energy sector and how Italy, in the security and strategic in a security and strategic approach, can play or is suited in order to address energy challenges. And first of all, the word of I don't know your expertise about the world of energy, but the world of energies is facing deep transformation with deep geopolitical implications. The heart of this transformation is the so-called shale revolution in the United States, which is transforming the country in a self-sufficient actor in terms of gas production and in one of the first producer in terms of oil. This is changing the global and the geopolitical scenario by several points of view. And as regards the consequences on Europe, we have two different dimensions. In terms of gas, the world of energy is today characterized by three main price area of gas, where the United States produce gas at a cost which is 1/3 of the cost that we produce it in the European or pay it in the European Union, and 1/4 of the cost of gas in Africa. This creates a competitive gap that there was until some years ago, and that is boosting the American recovery, but is also having an impact, a stagnating impact on European economy. So one of the challenge of the European, by the energy point of view, is to increase the competitive, to diversify its source of energy and to find solutions in order to decrease the cost of energy in comparison with the United States, which is a huge challenge. And I will elaborate on this later on. The second dimension of the shale revolution affects the oil sector, which is probably geopolitically more relevant, because since 2011, thanks to the shale revolution is a revolution based on the technological innovations linked to the horizontal fracking that allows, in particular in the United States, the discovery of new important sources and new important basins. And in terms of oil, since 2011, the United States has produced 3.5 million barrels per day. So they are about producing about 9 million barrels per day, while in 2011 they were producing 5.5 million barrels per day. And so this created an oversupply of oil in the world, which has replaced the disruption of oil due to geopolitical reasons, in particular in Libya, for the conflict, in Iran, for sanctions, in Sudan and in Syria for geopolitical reasons, and in other African countries. But a few days ago, a few months ago, last July, the price of oil collapsed because there was another key structural change, which was the decline of growth of the Chinese demand, which determined an oversupply of about 1 million barrels per day, which determined the fall of price that we are facing today from $110 per barrel to $48 it was yesterday. So a huge collapse, which is positive for an importing, net importing continent like Europe or a net importing country like Italy, but with the deep geopolitical implication for a lot of producing countries in the world, in particular in Africa, but also in Africa and the Middle East in particular. So this is what is happening in the world. These are the key game changer of the situation, and how is Italy within the European context suited in order to address these changes. First of all, of course, the fall of oil price for a net importer like Italy in terms of oil and gas is a good news. So this is a first positive element we can we can see. But another positive aspect that is often underlined and underestimated in the debate is that Italy, during the last 10 years, has diversified much more than other European countries. Probably the most diversifying country than at the European level, its source of supply, both in terms of gas and oil. So today our gas comes from Norway, the Netherlands, Qatar, and of course Algeria, Russia, and Libya. And so in case of crisis, the country is well positioned and well suited. For example, we import from Libya 9% of our gas, which is about 1% of the of the overall European gas. But in case of interruption of the Green Stream or of supply from Libya, this amount of gas can be replaced easily from other countries, and this for gas. In terms of oil, the oil market is more international than the gas market, which is regional and more rigid in terms of infrastructure. So we can say that the problem of Libya for Italy is not, first of all, an energy problem, but is mostly a political problem in terms of immigration and also other kind of security threats, more than the energy dimension. And this is due to the work of diversification that Italy has realized along the last decade, but also in prospect, Italy can become a European hub of gas and oil for its position together with Spain, for example, because a huge energy basins are in the Eastern Mediterranean, where the Levantine Basin has been discovered recently with a huge amount of gas, and most of all, also from Sub-Saharan Africa, where huge discoveries occurred in the last years. 2/3 of the overall discoveries of energy in the last 5 years have been in Sub-Saharan Africa, and the protagonist of these discoveries is the Italian company Eni, which is the first energy company in Africa as a whole, and which has been in the last 6 years the first energy company in the world in terms of discoveries of new resources. So what we can say is that Italy is well positioned in terms of current diversification and strategic diversification. For example, Italy, by the strategic point of view, supporting the idea of a south-north corridor of energy coming from Africa through LNG from Mozambique and Angola, for example, as a possible alternative of a east-west corridor, which is currently coming from a supply from Russia. But so this is by the strategic and geopolitical point of view. But another step for Italy is of course, at the European level and the European dimension. The energy union, which was quoted by Professor Telò, is so far just a box or an institutional framework, still empty of contents, but Europe desperately needs to integrate its infrastructure and corridor, for example, to strengthen connection between Spain and France, to strengthen connection between the crucial triangle of the three most important European economies, who are Italy, France, and Germany, and to change the direction of pipelines, which today at 95% run from west to east, so from Russia to the rest of Europe, and to east-west, to diversify and redirect them in the opposite direction, which imply strong investments and also a wider strategic thinking. Now, we hope that the European Union, the Energy Union, could become the good framework in order to make this, but the current energy crisis and the current controversial with Russia or in the Mediterranean could push ahead this infrastructural integration process Of course, the moment is not so good because with a low price context, energy companies or private actors are less in favor of infrastructure investments, but the prospect must be absolutely this one. And final point, Italy is also well positioned in terms of domestic reforms because the storage of Italy has respected the European directives in order to increase the storage of gas, and so the current situation is not so close to an emergency like many newspapers can let imagine. Of course, there are structural problems. Franceschini, journalist from Repubblica yesterday, moderating the panels, underlined that, of course, if a country like Italy is energy dependent, it's more difficult to implement an autonomous foreign policy. But there is, let's say, a room of maneuver also for an energy-dependent actor or country like Italy in order to develop, to further develop these perspectives. Of course, it is crucial to elaborate an effective strategy. For the first time, 2 years ago, the Italian government, the Monti government, approved the energy strategy. If I'm not wrong, Italy does not have a European foreign policy strategy. The only tentative effort was done by the Minister D'Alema during the Prodi government, but the experience collapsed before the end of the government led by Marta Dassù. But now we have at least an energy strategy, which central idea is to make Italy the central hub of gas and energy supply from the Mediterranean and from Africa. I think that this strategic vision could lead the country in the coming years, and the first goal is to deepen also in this sense the European integration and European infrastructure integration for making the continent competitive as the United States are becoming day by day. I think that without a more effective energy policy, any kind of economic growth and prospect for also for the future generation to become to develop a more dynamic labor market will remain on the paper if we don't update our strategy to the current transformation of the international context. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, Alessandro Madrone will take us through a different perspective on national security.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For me, it's a pleasure to speak here, also, as you said, as alumni. As in the case of our keynote speaker, I will underline some elements of continuity for Italy in the post-Cold War period, but when it comes to security, NATO is the main framework rather than the European Union de facto, if nothing else. So my presentation will focus on the relation between NATO and Italian foreign defense policy. It will be divided into 3 parts. First, I will outline why Italy has traditionally attached so great importance to NATO and to relation with the US. Second, I will address how Italy has intended NATO as an insurance policy, and I will come back to this term later on. And third, I will discuss the interplay between NATO missions and Italian national interests. So, first of all, why NATO and the US are so important for Italy? Well, as you know, Italy is surrounded by an unstable region from the Western Balkans to the southern shores of Mediterranean, and as argued by many scholars, Italy is not able alone to determine developments in those areas. Therefore, has historically relied on asymmetric alliances with more powerful allies to protect what in some measure are common interests and not just interests of Italy. Moreover, Italy's economic structure as an importer of raw material and energy resources, as explained by Raffaello, and as an exporter of goods and services, necessarily leads to global interests, ranging from the security of supply lines and roads to the stability of areas which are geographically or functionally linked to Italian economy and society. And this global interest, again, the country lacks the politically and military strength to protect it alone. So it's another reason why we come to alliances, either bilateral or multilateral. So both reasons have led Italy to consider the US and NATO a guarantor of European and Mediterranean security. So a guarantor role which was perceived as useful to the pursuance of national interests. And the Cold War obviously made the US and NATO a fundamental shield against the Soviet threats, but these reasons I outline have maintained the importance of NATO even after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact for the Italian foreign and defense policy, which was something that was, not that straightforward in the early 90s. In addition, Italy has often used its good transatlantic relation with the US in order to enhance its position vis-à-vis other European countries like France and Germany. And being in London, I don't have to dwell in that issue because the UK has also played that game very often in the past. Finally, NATO is important as a multilateral organization because it provides an institutional framework where Italy sits at the same table with the US, France, Germany, UK, and as institutional framework, NATO helps middle powers like Italy to negotiate with a great power such as the US, somehow a bit mitigating the mismatch of power which is otherwise dominant in a mere pure bilateral relation. So having said that, let's turn to the second part of my presentation on NATO as insurance policy. What does it mean, insurance policy, in this context? With this expression, I refer to the role played by NATO, also after the Cold War, by gathering together democratic countries and providing a political military apparatus ready to be used at any time to protect shared security interests. So usually an insurance policy requires an investment by the contracting parties, regardless of the actual occurrence of the danger against which we pay to be protected. Similarly, in the 90s, the NATO role of deterrence has not disappeared together with the Cold War, but it has remained crucial in the strategic calculus of several actors involved in the European security environment, until the crisis in Ukraine has brought again this deterrence role up to the forefront in the spotlights. And indeed, the 2010 NATO strategic concept considered collective defense one of the core tasks of the alliance. So such insurance policy was enlarged together with NATO membership toward Eastern Europe and the Balkans. And from an Italian perspective, the benefits deriving from the enlargement process were twofold. On the one hand, a broader and stronger alliance has promoted democratic developments in newly accessed countries, benefiting the European political and economic stability as well. On the other hand, this process has contributed to the stabilization and pacification of an area which is close to Italy and linked to its economy. So, for example, I'd say the Western Balkans. So it's not by accident that Italy supported the NATO membership of countries such as Slovenia, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, up to Croatia and Albania. So in that sense, the NATO was useful as an insurance policy for Italian national security first, but also for the security and stability of an area which is important in economic and political terms for Italy. However, in Italian view, such enlargement should not be managed against Moscow. It should rather be coupled with a cooperative, broad and deep diplomatic engagement with Russia. And indeed, it's not by accident that Italy strongly supported the creation of the NATO-Russia Council, which was established by a treaty signed in Italy, near Rome, at Pratica di Mare military bases in 2002. The main reason is that Russia is a crucial commercial partner and supplier of raw material and energy sources, as said by Raffaello, but also a market for export for Italian manufacturing. So, for example, from an economic point of view, Italy is the fourth commercial partner of Russia, and in 2013, the two countries exchanged goods for 31 billion of euro. So, obviously, as you can imagine, the war in Ukraine has put in contrast these two traditional national interests of Italy. On the one hand, having peace and stability in Europe, with NATO acting as an insurance policy. On the other hand, having a partnership with Russia. So, in order to pursue simultaneously both these interests, Italy is somehow contributing to the military and political pressure that NATO is exerting on Russia. So this pressure results, as I call it in a paper, in the call from some NATO member states to be in trenches, in trincea, against Russia, both in economic terms with the sanctions and in military terms. So maybe you don't know, but in recent years, NATO has regularly provided air policing of the airspace of the Baltic countries because they don't have adequate air capabilities by a turnover of the air forces of other countries. And in 2014, it was the turn of Italy. And the Baltic states have asked Italy to extend this patrolling of their airspace also in 2015, in addition to the one managed by the Norwegian air forces, because of the increased violation of national airspace by Russian fighter aircraft, and because of the effectiveness of the Eurofighter Typhoon aircraft piloted by Italians in doing air-to-air interception. So today, and by today I mean March 3rd, not this year or in current times, but this day, as in many other days in recent months, there is a Eurofighter Typhoon piloted by an Italian pilot, which is coming very close to a Russian Sukhoi and is escorting the fighter aircraft out of the NATO airspace, which is seen that maybe you have seen in the movie Top Gun at the beginning, and it happens daily. So it happens daily, and this demonstrates that Italy is contributing to Allied security. It's not without risk, it's not without cost in military and economic terms, but Italy is in the trenches with the Allies, but consider the trenches are not an end per se. They are an instrument of a strategy. They should be an instrument of a strategy to reach a new agreement with Russia to build together a renewed security architecture for Europe. So that's the way Italy is trying to combine these contradicting interests, contributing to the insurance policy, to the security and stability of Europe, but also continuing to consider Russia as a partner and not an element. And this use of military forces as a foreign policy tool also applies to the third and last part of my presentation, NATO mission. Between 1990 and 2012, on average, Italy participated in around 25 multinational military operations abroad per year, under UN, EU, NATO aegis, or within coalition of the willing. In the first decade of this century, on average, 8,700 Italian troops were deployed abroad every year. A mission ranged from air bombing in Libya in 2011 to naval counter-piracy activities in the Gulf of Aden, from peacekeeping in the Balkans and Lebanon to counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan. And 134 Italian servicemen and women died in operational theaters in these 22 years. So why such an effort? In my view, there are two groups of reasons. The first group is directly linked with the operational theater where Italian national interests were at stake. This is the case, for example, Western Balkans. So Italy intervened in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Albania, mainly because there was a direct national interest in stopping a civil war very close to national territory, in preventing a regional destabilization, in preventing the creation of safe havens for international criminality so close to Italian shores, and also because, as mentioned before, the pacification of this area was functional to economic projection of Italy in terms of export, in terms of transit roads, etc. All of this does not apply to Afghanistan. And here comes, in my view, the second group of reasons for Italian participation to international mission. Reasons which were present also in the Balkans, but that were crucial in the Afghan case. You have to know that Italy deployed troops in Afghanistan from the beginning of Operation Enduring Freedom, 1 month after the 9/11 attack, until now. And it has been in charge of the Regional Command West, one of the regional command Afghanistan was divided, was the only European country to shoulder alone the burden of a regional command for 8 years. The UK tried and then quit because was unable to shoulder alone this burden. Italy also commanded the whole ISAF mission from 2005 to 2006. Again, why such an effort? Remember what I said before at the beginning of the importance of asymmetric alliances and NATO. 3 main reasons. First, Italy went to Kabul because it was important to maintain good relations with Washington. Full stop. The war in Afghanistan was a priority for the second term of Bush administration and for the first term of Obama administration. They both asked to allies to do more. So Italy considered that it was worth it to make an effort to remain a close and credible ally of the US. And there is an expression which captured this behavior, is from Crimea to Afghanistan. And by Crimea, I do not refer to the current war in Ukraine. I refer to the fact that between 1853 and 1856, the Kingdom of Piedmont, il Regno di Piemonte, sent around 18,000 troops to fight in the Crimea War, where no national interest was at stake, but because such military effort, alongside France and the UK, enhanced the Piedmont request for support from Paris and London against the Austro-Hungarian Empire in order to unify the Italian peninsula. And actually, this strategy worked well. As much as, for example, in 1861, the British Navy escorted the Garibaldi troops from Sicily to Calabria by preventing the enemy navy to sink their poor boats. So 150 years after that Crimea War, Italy has deployed up to 4,500 troops in a faraway region in Central Asia where no direct national interest was at stake because of the alliance with the US. Of course, you may doubt whether this has had a proper return from the US in recent years, and I have some doubts too, but the rationale is there. It was not by accident. This was the first but not the only rationale for the Italian engagement in Afghanistan. The second rationale was NATO, because Afghanistan was important not only for the US but for NATO too. It was the largest military operation in NATO history, the most high-intensity one, with the highest number of casualties within Western soldiers, with the credibility of the alliance perceived as at stake. So in that circumstances, Italy considered that the insurance policy, I mentioned before, somehow required to pay a fee. And both progressive and conservative governments decided that they could not leave ISAF because Italy's credibility was at stake too. You may remember the motto "Together in, together out." In other words, leaving Afghanistan before the other allies would have weakened the Italian position within NATO. For example, when it comes to ask to NATO allies a greater commitment in the Mediterranean, or when a NATO top military post has to be assigned to member states. Do not forget that in the years Taliban insurgents increased, the chairman of the military committee in NATO, the highest military body, was the Italian Admiral Giampaolo Di Paola. The third and last reason why Italy went to Afghanistan has to do with the status of Italy within the international community. And this is very not that tangible, difficult to assess. But Professor Telon mentioned the fear of being outside the G7 as a ranking of countries in the international arena. So, in the post-Cold War period, Italy has considered its contribution to global security through crisis management operation as a way to enhance its international status and prestige. It's not by accident that in the surveys mentioned by Professor Telot, the experts are more happy about the use of military forces as an instrument of foreign policy. You may remind that in the 90s, a reform of the UN Security Council was proposed to bring in two of the losers of the World War II, Germany and Japan, and leaving outside the third loser, Italy. Well, France lost the war too in 40 days and was occupied for 5 years and collaborated with the Nazis, but de Gaulle was great in portraying France as a winner of the war. Anyway, when this proposal in the 90s was fielded, Italy organized a campaign to stop it, which was successful, and one of the main arguments was the contribution to international peacekeeping operations should be a criteria to be in the UN Security Council, because it's a way a country shoulder its responsibilities, and in this ranking, Italy ranked much higher than Germany and other European countries. So let me conclude just with one caveat. I left NATO intervention in Libya out of my speech because it's a story very contested, very recent, difficult to analyze still, but I'm ready to take question on it. So in conclusion, in my view, Italy's grand strategy, which is the title of this panel, exists. It is based on the geopolitics of the Mediterranean and European regions and on the global economic interest of a middle power like Italy. And therefore, is based on the need for asymmetric alliances with powerful allies and multilateral frameworks to play foreign and defense policy. To mention the EU as a framework to play foreign policy, NATO applies also for foreign and defense policy. And within this Italian grand strategy, two elements are particularly important with regard to NATO. First, NATO is seen as an insurance policy for national security, but not as a trench against Russia, because Russia is seen as a partner in light of Pratica di Mare spirit. Second, military operations have been considered by Italy as a tool to maintain good relations with the US and to enhance its position within NATO and within the international community in general, as well as to pay the fee for the insurance policy. So, could you find these elements written down in an Italian strategic document, like the UK National Security Strategy or the French Livre Blanc on defense? No. As said by Raffaello, the attempts to have a kind of grand strategy so far failed. The grand strategy is defined and implemented de facto, often through informal coordination by various institutional actors, without much media coverage. And I've been working for 8 years with the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Foreign and Defense Committees in the Parliament, the Presidency of the Council of Ministers, and I can tell you that, of course, personalities do matter, as in other countries. And you may think about the difference between Blair and Cameron or Hollande and Sarkozy. But Italian personalities do not act in a strategic vacuum. And the observers that from abroad states that Italy has no strategy only because they don't find a written document explaining it are a bit superficial and wrong in this regard. So the novelty, and this is my very last point, is that the Defense Ministry is working on a white book on defense and international security. The guidelines for the white book were presented last July, and the product should be presented to the head of state, to the government, to the parliament in March. So let's see what comes out from the white book and if there will be a kind of formalization of a grand strategy, at least for the defense and foreign policy domain, not for the whole energy and cultural and economic projection of Italy. And since representatives from my institute, from MII, are working on the writing of this white book, I would be more than happy to return to LSE again to discuss it. So thank you for your attention.
It's good to hear that Italy does have a grand strategy and that we're going to join the rest of the main countries with actually writing it out, so every other country can see. Yeah, so now Dr. Nicola Calotti.
Yeah, can I don't think
It's working.
Okay.
It's working.
It's working? Okay,
Yeah.
Sorry. First of all, thank you. Thanks for to all the organizers and the Italian society, because I have the feeling that maybe I don't need a mic, right? Yeah. I have the feeling that I'll try nonetheless. I have the feeling that Italy is sometimes or too often an overlooked country in Europe. It's a bit. My argument is that there are some good reasons for why this is the case, and I'll try to mention a few reasons. So, in a sense, I'll be a bit more pessimistic than you guys. I might be an observer from outside. I might be a little bit superficial, but I don't. I see some problems in Italian foreign policy, and I'm trying to explain you which ones. So let's start from the question. So Italian national security, exploring Italy's grand strategy in the wider international system. As I said, I will paint a bleak picture, in a sense, in line with the current morale of the country. First of all, it's easy. I will scale down the ambitions of the question. Clearly, Italy has little to say if we take into account the wider international system. Indeed, it potentially has a lot to say. Okay. It potentially has a lot to say when it comes to the regional, to the neighborhood and to the regional system, by which I mean mainly three areas: Northern Africa and part of the broader Middle East, Europe, and the Western Balkans. Western Balkans not necessarily in terms of conflict prevention or conflict management, but also in terms of potentially common interest and constructive cooperation. So one thing here before moving on, I would say that in Northern Africa or even in other areas, Italian foreign policy is intermingled with and maybe often inspired, let's put it this way, by the interests of certain big groups such as Finmeccanica and Eni. Raffaello hinted a little bit at this. So this can be an interesting issue to explore. Or put in slightly different terms, we might even make a case that the foreign policies of these companies, Eni, Finmeccanica, are getting more comprehensive and broader in terms of geographical scope than Italian security policy is. Anyhow, what is my argument here? So my general argument here about Italy's role in international politics starts from the end of the Cold War. In the early 90s, there was a great book by Carlo Maria Santoro. He wrote a very interesting and insightful book where he described Italy as a middle power. So he argued that throughout its history, since the unification onwards, Italy struggled to find its proper place in the international system, ranging from a great power strategy, maybe the weakest of the great powers in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, to a sort of irrelevance produced by the rigidities of the Cold War. So the argument by Santoro was the Cold War is over, now finally Italy has some space, and finally Italy has found its proper role in the international system. Not a great power, not an irrelevant power, but a middle power. So my argument has two parts. Firstly, the first one is a kind of calculated provocation. So today, 25 years later, and with an eye to the foreseeable future, Italy is slipping into the position of a small power. Secondly, this is not a big problem in itself. Small powers have demonstrated that they can have an impact in international politics under certain conditions, but using certain strategies. So the problem, in my view, is instead that Italy is not very well equipped to pursue these small power strategies. So the policy recommendation, I think Italy should start to think in these terms, will not change if you argue that I was maybe a bit ungenerous and Italy has few assets compared to other small states. So in other terms, the strategies that Italy should pursue to achieve its objectives do not change if we think of Italy as either a declining middle power or a small power with a few assets. Now, in the rest of the talk, I will briefly elaborate on these 2 points. Firstly, Italy is slipping into the position of a small power. I won't spend much time on this, but if we look at the world in 1991, where Carlo Maria Santoro was writing, and if we look at the world today, we know that many things have changed. And if you compare the international system in 2040, the international system would be very different back then, ahead. So some quick numbers. In 1990, Italy has the 6th largest GDP in the world, ahead of the UK. Now, in 2020, this year, it will be the 9th GDP, and we will soon be out of the top 10. The gap is increasing with the major blocs in the world. We all know the story. I won't repeat it. We know the rise of the BRICS, not only the BRICS, but also the means. We can use other indicators, military power. We can use population. Again, in terms of population, we are a declining country. Probably Italy will have a smaller population in 2040 than it has today. And this is another story, but also in light of this, it's a bit bizarre to listen to the debates about the immigration in our country. But that's another story. But this story is simple and well known. The international environment had its very challenges for powers such as Italy. So the second point, what strategies can small powers or declining middle powers use to influence international politics? There are a few strategies. I will here mention just a few, and necessarily in a cursory way. One is to be able to prioritize, concentrate the available resources on a specific policy, on specific issues, and back it with good, sound, and convincing arguments. Here the challenge is to be able to frame an issue in a certain way which resonates with prior technical, normative, whatever, beliefs. So then building a strong coalition around it, certain states or NGOs, and then consistently commit resources to these few policies. Another strategy would be to make substantive use of institutional opportunity structures, such as chairing meetings and engaging in an agenda setting. Setting the agenda, distributing papers, preparing reports, etc. All these activities increase the visibility, credibility, and reputation of the country, and multiply the opportunities to influence debates and our policies. So, other strategy might be available. Cultural diplomacy might be another possibility. Italy might have also some sort of soft power, especially in the Mediterranean area. In this context, it could make a better and more efficient use of the institutions of Italian culture all over the world. But again, I have a sense that there's no strategy here. So final point, what's the problem here? My point is that so far, Italy has not really been able to use these strategies properly. We can even say that it's not, in general, very well equipped to pursue these strategies. The reasons are several. We probably all know them. And they lie at the heart of the Italian political system. They refer to a lack of both political and administrative capacity. I guess one of the vices, or one of the traditional vices of Italian foreign policy has been to put much more attention to the politics dimension rather than to the policy dimension of international problems. So we always, try to. So my feeling is that we don't really well prepared policy issues. We don't commit consistently resourcing around them, build a coalition to shape the debates, to shape the policies. We can see it within the European Union. We've been mentioning, I think yesterday you talked a lot about the European Union. You had a session devoted to it. So in certain aspects, northern member states have been able to shape EU foreign defense policy more and better than Italy did. And that's a problem. In general, Italy has made limited use of its presidencies, both in the context of the now almost defunct G8 or in the European Union. Last year, sorry to say, but the presidency that Italy had of the European Union was a missed opportunity in many sense. So to sum up, my plea is that Italy should take more seriously these small state strategies, become aware of their importance for Italian foreign policy, and consequently to build the political and administrative capacity to back them. I guess that this is not an easy task because it goes against decades of diplomatic, political, administrative know-how. It's something that Mario Telò was mentioning at the end of his talk when he referred to that Italy should have more professional behavior within the EU policymaking and diplomatic activity. I think that this resonates with what he was saying. But the alternative of the paradox is to neither behave like a regional great power in the neighborhood or in Europe, because we don't have the resources, nor to be smart and use institutional, context-related, policy-oriented, more argumentative strategies.
Well, thank you so much for a thought-provoking presentation. I was wondering whether, because YAI also has more of a direct intervention also and is part of the policy-making apparatus, whether there was any type of response, or do you agree? Do you disagree? Okay, yeah, and okay as well. So we'll probably take a couple of questions and then kind of see, try to answer both of them.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. You said you purposely left out NATO intervention in Libya, and you also made, you spoke of how Italy looks after its interest in sending troops in missions abroad, and how Italy tries to strengthen its relations with the US, but how much or to what extent is often Italy not at the mercy of the US and NATO, and how much are we basically pushed around? Because, for example, during the Libya crisis, Germany refused to give its bases to military action on Libya, whereas Italy, despite having big economic interests in Libya, gave its bases. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? We're going to try to combine a couple.
So my question is mainly on, since a lot of criticism yesterday was raised to Federica Mogherini and on the Ukrainian crisis. So it seems that the duopoly, the Franco-German duopoly, has monopolized in a way the conversation both with the Kremlin and with Ukraine. So despite the expertise of Mogherini being on Russia, so there is in a way much of of Mogherini being totally sidelined in this debate. Is there any chance for Italy to really start playing a role in this crisis as well, or will we continue to see only Merkel and Hollande talk with these leaders? Thanks.
Anyone?
Thank you for both questions. On Libya, here I have a very cynical and, if you wish, provocative view, but I say that still to make my homeworks in terms of research. So what I think is that, put it bluntly, the national interest of Italy at that time was to keep Gaddafi in place, because it ensured energy supplies, but mainly because it ensured the stability of a country which has not strong state institution to undertake a democratic transition. So the risk to end up in a civil war, in an anarchy, was very high, and indeed it realized. So also because the Western community bombed, but then did not send a peacekeeping mission to stabilize the country. But anyway, the calculus was that it's better to have this dictatorship, which, by the way, was becoming less and less crude, and rather than the Caliphate, the Islamic State, or the civil war. And as the Europe was not intervening in Syria, where the bloodshed was about 100,000 dies, there was no such humanitarian pressure to go to Libya. So, because France wanted to go to Libya to have a regime change and improve its access to energy resources in Libya, the French government mounted the coalition to go there. And this is demonstrated by the way that Sarkozy entered the meeting which endorsed the air operation by saying the French fighter aircraft has already taken off and are flying to Libya. They're going to bomb within 1 hour. Are you with me or without me? So there was no effort to negotiate the action by France, but rather to have the endorsement of the international community on this action. So Italy at that time was in a weak position also because the government was weak for internal reasons, because of the division within the conservative coalition and other factors. Italy tried until the very end to have a negotiate solution, a diplomatic solution with the Gaddafi regime. It was not possible because the US and the UK followed the French line of having a military intervention. So when it became clear that France, UK, and US would have intervened in any case, with or without Italy on board, the calculus was, let's stay with the next winner. So let's abandon the regime which is doomed to collapse because of the Western intervention, and let's be on board with the Western intervention to open contacts with the opposition that will become the new leaders after the regime collapse. So it was a U-turn for Italy. It was paradoxical, but it happens. It happens also to other powers that relate to dictatorship then collapse. You may think about the US or European approach toward the revolution and counter-revolution in Egypt, when one day you support the square, the demonstrators, and the other day you support the generals because of the Islamist movement. So Italy did this U-turn, and here NATO helped because in the very first days you didn't have a NATO integrated command. You have a coalition command where the targets of the bombing were decided somehow between Paris, London, and Washington. When Italy decided to join the coalition, it put to disposal the air bases, but asked for integrated NATO command. It was not alone. Also other countries asked for this integrated command. And Italy obtained this, so the command of the operation shifted from this fluffing coalition command to the NATO integrated one. So you had the institution. You had a representative of Italy at the table. So when at certain tables the French military officer asked to bomb the oil factories of any of the Italian energy company in Libya, the Italian representative said, well, you don't need to destroy the strategic asset of Italy to weaken the regime. You can just destroy the electricity grid, so the regime will not have the electricity coming from the oil plants, but you don't have to destroy our oil plants there, sorry. So that was a way where the institutional framework presented by NATO was used to protect national interests even in the worst scenario, where your allies go to bomb another your partner, which is crucial, or well, not crucial, but it's important for your economic relation, for the stability of the Mediterranean, for the management of the migratory flow, and so far and so on. Thank you. Sorry for the long response.
Yes, I would like to react to this stereotype or idea that Italy's foreign policy is led by big private groups. At least every country is suspected to be led by private interest. When Bush declared the war to Iraq, the narrative told that energy groups were leading, or when France intervened in Africa, when the UK, and of course there are areas of where also economic interests lead. But for example, if we look at the most important intervention of Italy, first of all, Libya, as was underlined right now. The interest of, for example, the energy company was not to intervene, and as was underlined the question, Italy could also, like Germany, abstain. Germany at the time was within the UN Security Council, while Italy was not, but have a different position, while Italy, for political reasons, the alliance with the US, and decided to contribute to that mission. Also, if the economic interests were going in the opposite direction first, or Italy supporting sanctions to Iran, where the economic interests are exactly the opposite, because Eni is one of the most important company in Iran, or Italy supporting sanctions to Russia. Nevertheless, the interest of its economic interest, not only of the leading energy company, but also of other companies, goes in the opposite area. And we could continue with the list of examples. These to say that if we want to select or to analyze Italy's foreign policy, it is reductive, and also in the opposite sense. Eni does not need Italy in order to be the first hydrocarbon producer in Africa, because it's a technical activity where, for example, the biggest discovery of Eni's history in Mozambique in 2011 was 4 kilometers below the level, 2 kilometers below the level of the sea, and 2 kilometers below the level of the sand. And where Italy or the Italian government was not, or politics was not absolutely involved, like in many other African or international countries. So it is could become misleading to overlap always or so often the two cases. I think the analysis should select better about what the role that Italy is playing with Russia, or is Italy. But the point of Federica Mogherini is the structural weakness of the High Representative as given by the Lisbon Treaty, and to be representative of nothing, because the European foreign security policy is something very volatile or extremely volatile at the moment. But Italy is playing a role in the Russian crisis. Italy's prime minister is going to Moscow in mid-March. Italy is talking to Russia in order to find out a possible solution, or about the Libyan crisis, in order to put pressure through Russia to Egypt in order to play a certain role. And also the High Representative is, of course, she was just appointed, and just a couple of months after her appointment, one of the worst, probably the worst crisis in Europe since the end of the Second World War occurred. So for a figure in a moment of deep weakness of Europe. But the key difference between Federica Mogherini now and Katie Ashton before, in my view, at the moment, is a political difference. Katie Ashton did not have even the support of her own government, which was the Cameron government and a conservative government, while she had been appointed by the Labour government, so not even a strong relationship with her own government. Now, Federica Mogherini has been appointed by a politically stronger government, and she has also, in a way, the possible support of this government. Of course, possible incremental improvements of her political rule, very tiny improvements, could be seen at least in the medium term. But I would not say that Italy, or also her figure, is not playing a role now, because we didn't see the photo of her face in the first opportunity with Hollande and Merkel. And let's say that I much prefer diplomacy when it works without showing off or being on the front line, rather than when as often happens also for Italy, but not only, it is on the front line or on the headlines. So I think that to express a correct judgment on Mogherini's performance, we should wait at least some months and consider, the biggest crisis after the Second World War, after just a month that she is in charge.
If I may, just a point. I mean, as told also by Professor Telò, we live in a period of renationalization of policy, with much less willingness and room to devote powers to a supranational body by the main member states, not only UK and France that have always been skeptical about it, but also Germany and many others. So it's difficult, as mentioned by Raffaello, for a position which is weak to appear strong in a way. But I'm also, in line with Raffaello, a bit less skeptical on this because, well, first of all, if you talk with Brussels policymaker, Federica Mogherini is much better than Cathy Ashton, at least because she wants a greater role for the European Union in foreign security policy. I'm not sure that Cathy Ashton did want it per se. So no, and I'm also reporting, a bit the atmosphere of some colleagues in Brussels, and this willingness is materializing also on the effort to initiate a process of strategic reflection that may lead to a new European security strategy, which is badly needed because the last document is 2003, the world has changed, and the report on the implementation of the European security strategy in 2008 is not a strategic document. So the comparison and the terms of reference is 12 years old. So this is one way which in the medium term may help a convergence of member states towards a European policy and may also increase the role of institutions and institutional actors as the representative.
Dr. Palotti, concluding remarks?
Yeah, like 5 seconds on the Mogherini question. I don't think it's a problem of Mogherini at all. Even institutionally, it was not her role. It was the president of the European Council, if anything, should have been go to Moscow, not Mogherini, who was the foreign minister. So it has been a buzz that doesn't really have any meaning in my view. I don't think that the insistence of the Italian government on having the foreign policy portfolio was particularly a smart one, but that's another story. But I don't think that Mogherini had a particularly bad effect, or she's not an actor in the crisis.
Great. Well, then please join me in thanking our distinguished and informative panel, which I thought was really great. So thank you.